But for today, we have one more lesson in Jude, and very closely related to the other two lessons in Jude, especially the last lesson in Jude that we looked at last week, because, as we pointed out, Jude wrote this letter specifically because of certain people creeping into the church, unnoticed, false teachers, we might call them. That's what they were. We could probably call them other things as well, but one thing they were that Jude seems to be focusing on more than anything else is false teachers. And we talked about how do we identify false teachers. Well, Jesus said in Matthew 7:15 and 16, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles?" So Jesus seemed to be under the impression, and I think he would know, that you can recognize a false teacher by their fruits. That's the only thing by which you can recognize them. And that goes not just for false teachers, that goes for anybody, but especially false teachers. Look at their fruits. Well, when we're talking about a teacher, the number one fruit that they're going to be producing is going to be their teaching, but there's other fruits that a person also bears, like their general behavior and conduct, or maybe the extension or logical extension of their teachings, maybe some things that they believe in or say or do that is an extension or comes from what they're teaching or believing. Those kinds of fruits. Fruits are inherently outward things. So you can't read a person's mind or heart, but you can see their fruits. Yeah, Wayne?
Just a side note, I was reading this week where the Lutheran school system is changing their name to Unity Christian Schools to try to bring in all denominations into their education program. But they did have a small paragraph in there stating for their brethren that we will still be legislatively bound to the Missouri Synod. That's who takes care and gives the directions for all of them here. So it's a little bit of sheep's clothing. In other words, we'll change the name to Unity Christian Schools, but we're still going to teach our doctrine.
Yeah.
Most people won't pay attention.
Yeah. It's just a matter of a word, that is designed, obviously, to attract non-Lutheran people, but that may imply that they won't be getting Lutheran doctrine. But like you said, that wasn't the case. That wouldn't change. Well, you take that and apply it to any a Christian who calls himself or herself a Christian, but yet is not teaching Christian doctrine. You could see how deception could be easy in that case, because if somebody's taken to be a brother, you may trust what they say, but what if what they say is not right? Then, like we talked about, it becomes a personal thing where we may struggle to accept that it's not right because of my personal relationship to this person. They would never deceive me. They wouldn't lie to me. They wouldn't tell me something that wasn't true. Well, all of that may be true. At least they wouldn't do it on purpose, maybe. That could be the case. They wouldn't lie to you on purpose, but maybe they're deceived and they're teaching a false doctrine that they were taught, and they're not deliberately lying to you, maybe, but they are by extension, because they are perpetuating a false doctrine that they've been taught. Well, Jude seems to be dealing more with people who are more deliberate in what they're doing. Nevertheless, we cannot overlook the fact that this doesn't mean that they were standing up. In fact, everything in the letter would indicate the opposite. They weren't standing up and saying, "Hey, we got a new doctrine we want to share with y'all, and you should accept it." But that's not creeping in at all. But these people crept in with their false doctrine, or else maybe they didn't creep in, all of them. Maybe they were already there, but then the false doctrine crept in among them, and then that would be just another way of creeping in, a less direct way, I guess. But if we examine the fruits of these people, of any person, we can judge them. And that is the kind of judging that we are not just allowed to do, but commanded to do, by looking at fruits, the fruits of their beliefs and teachings and doctrines, whatever they stand for. Look at the fruits, the teaching itself, and whatever else it might result in. Those are the fruits. Whether or not, what their motive is not, I won't say it's not important, but it's definitely of secondary importance, because whether they're teaching it on purpose or not, whether they know it's wrong and they're teaching it anyway, or whether they truly, sincerely think it's right, that's secondary to the fact that they're teaching it. And other people need to be aware of it so they don't fall into the same thing. And the way that the standard of comparison is always God's revealed will. John 7:17, Jesus said, "If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority." It's kind of a difficult statement if you think about it, because it may lead us to ask, well, how will we know? Just because we want to do God's will? Well, if nothing else, I think we can see in that statement that if you truly want to know God's will and do God's will, you will put forth the effort to find out if what somebody says is from God. And God has ways through His providence of helping people come to that conclusion. It's not necessarily that you'll know it every time instantly, or else Jude would have no reason to be writing this letter. But God can help, and He does help every time we compare a teaching with this. Is that thing that has been said what this says? Which is kind of what we've been looking at in our sermon period the last few weeks. So like Jesus, the Apostle Paul also had quite a bit to say about false teachers. In Acts chapter 20, verses 29 and 30, he told the elders of the congregation at Ephesus, "I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things to draw away the disciples after them." Fierce wolves, he calls them. They're going to come in, and they're not going to spare the flock. Their purpose is to draw away disciples. So for Paul, it wasn't a question of if false teachers would rise up, but when. And they were to be on the lookout, the elders of the congregation there. Wolves is a very descriptive way of referring to them. What kinds of things do you think of when you think of a wolf? Predator. They are usually not alone. Of course, there's the lone wolf thing and all that, but I'm no expert. But they are generally not alone. They're pack animals, and they're very effective in that way. They're savage, aren't they? I mean, they are fierce. They're scary, especially the big ones. That's kind of the word that's used here, fierce or savage, depending on your translation in that verse, Acts 20, verse 29. So that's how he describes false teachers. Now, we might be inclined to give the benefit of the doubt, which is a good thing in principle, but usually when false teachers are discussed by an inspired person, they don't use that, well, they're probably sincere. Whether they're sincere is irrelevant to Paul and Jude. The fact is, here's their fruit, and they need to be people need to be made aware of them, and they need to be dealt with because of what they're teaching. Not necessarily in one way, viewed in one way because they're sincere versus whether they're not sincere. They are depicted as wolves, and Jude in our text here is going to refer to them in a number of ways, uses all kinds of illustrations to refer to the false teachers. So the Bible writers intended to equip the people who would be reading it to withstand false teaching, both by telling the truth of the matter and informing them and us of the consequences of false teaching and how to avoid it. So like 2 Timothy 2:14, remind them of these things and charge them before God not to quarrel about words, which does no good, but only ruins the hearers. But instead, he tells Timothy to rightly divide the word of truth, which means to correctly interpret Scripture, and shun profane and idle babblings. And if he did that, he could avoid making a mistake like Hymenaeus and Philetus made that he calls out in verses 17 and 18 of 2 Timothy 2. He says their false teaching spread like cancer and overthrew the faith of some Christians. So in our lesson text here, Jude provides a more in-depth discussion about false teachers that we can find anywhere in Scripture. So after he told the Christians here to contend earnestly for the faith, he said why that was so, because of these false teachers who had crept in unnoticed, wolves in sheep's clothing, to use Jesus' words. But to do this effectively, the Christians needed to know more about these people. So he's going to tell them. Last week we saw how he says they rely on their dreams. Never a good idea. And if your dreams are anything like my dreams, then you see how foolish that can be, to rely on dreams, even if you are able to remember your dreams in vivid detail, which sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, but I would never rely on whatever it is. That just create a lot of stress that I don't really want to deal with. So then he says they defile the flesh, reject authority, they blaspheme the glorious ones. Verse 10, he says they blaspheme whatever they don't know. That word blaspheme is also translated speak evil of, to rail at, they revile, they speak abusively against, they slander, they insult, they criticize. People who criticize or insult or slander things they don't understand. Those people are alive and well today. And that's basically the tactic that, if I don't understand something, I speak evil of it. I revile it. I just, brush it off and act like it's dumb, or that you're dumb for believing it or saying it. So that may not be exactly what Jude had in mind, but we do see that pretty commonly today. He says they corrupt themselves in the things they know naturally, like brute beasts. But then he compared them to some historical figures, Cain and Balaam and Korah. We didn't really get to that last week, but his message was pretty plain. Christians cannot sit idly by and allow jealous, greedy, power-hungry people to destroy the church. False teachers and their doctrines must not go unchallenged. And that's what he's going to continue here in verses 12 through 23, especially 12 through 19, I guess. Any thoughts or comments so far? All right, here he goes. Verse 12. More descriptive references. These, that is, these false teachers, are hidden reefs, the ESV says, at your love feasts. As they feast with you without fear, shepherds feeding themselves, waterless clouds swept along by winds, fruitless trees in late autumn, twice dead, uprooted, wild waves of the sea, casting up the foam of their own shame, wandering stars for whom the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved forever. We'll just hold up right there for a second. Lots of ways that he refers to them. Hidden reefs. Anybody's version say something different than that? I know it does. Spots. Okay. Though that's quite a bit different, isn't it? Hidden reefs. Spots. Hidden rocks, okay. That's a lot more close to, yeah. Blemishes. So, okay, you see the two different thoughts that are sort of side by side here, depending on the translation people. Hidden reefs or hidden rocks, spots and blemishes. The thing is, the word that's used there for that, it could go either way. So some see it as a reference to hidden rocks or reefs, and some see it as spots or blemishes in their love feast. I tend to prefer the hidden rocks or hidden reefs in line with the rest of what he says about them. So you think about hidden reefs. This is the best picture I could find. It doesn't look that threatening, but just imagine it's way bigger than that and way more hidden than that. What potential danger could that cause? Yeah, if you're in a boat, a hidden rock or reef is not your friend and could really create a lot of problems for you and could make you not have a ship anymore, even. Or a similar analogy would be like an iceberg, okay? Much more infamous, I guess, in the ship sinking world, mainly because of one historical incident. But you think about, it's become like a byword, it's just the tip of the iceberg. And the idea is that what you see on the surface, there's a lot more going on below the surface that you can't necessarily see, especially at nighttime. And, while sometimes, this one doesn't stick out that much farther underneath than it does at the top, but some of them could. And the people on the Titanic could tell you that, because that is at least presumably what happened to them in that ship. They struck an iceberg. You know why they struck it? Because it was hidden. They saw what they could see, but what they couldn't see was what brought them down. So hidden reef, a hidden rock, is something that is lurking under the surface that has the potential to put you in extreme danger before you even realize it. And once you do realize it, it's too late. At least not too late for you to have any hope of coming out of it, but it's too late. It's already happened. The damage has already been done before you even realize it. And then you're having to work backwards or work out of the damage that's done instead of avoiding the damage. So that's the danger of a hidden reef or a hidden rock, and that would be the idea behind the word hidden there. If he said they're like reefs, that could mean any number of things and wouldn't really be very clear. But when we think about a hidden reef or a hidden rock, that helps us to understand maybe what he's getting at. Of course, there's also that possibility of it actually meaning a spot, which scripturally speaking is much more easily understood as far as what a blemish would represent. And you think about in their love feast, which by the way was apparently just what they called what we would call a potluck or a fellowship meal. They call them love feasts. Love feast sounds weird to me. No offense to Jude or anybody else that call them that, but that sounds like a weird thing to me that wouldn't give the right idea. And just sounds weird no matter what you make of it. But that's apparently what it was. They were fellowship meals. So these people, as part of the church, or having crept in, would be taking part in these meals, but Jude is telling them they're blemishes, if that's what the word, if that's what he meant. He's saying they're blemishes. They may not have realized they were blemishes at your love feast, but they are. And they, like rotten apples or like a rotted fruit, as it goes, it is said that you get a rotten one in there and it'll affect the other ones, the good ones. So if you got these rotten people among the brethren, what's going to happen to the brethren? They're going to be tainted as well, eventually. It's kind of like leaven, how Paul referred to them as leaven. These people who were living sinful lifestyles without shame or without any reserve whatsoever. He referred to them as leaven, and he said if you don't get him out, it's going to leaven the whole lump. So that's the idea, if that's what he meant by the word that's translated hidden reefs in the ESV. Then he calls them waterless clouds. This one's a lot easier to understand. And especially whenever you think about a part of the world over there. We may look at the prospect of rain and think, well, this is going to ruin my day. Ron probably looks at it differently than the rest of us. But if you are needing rain, and in that part of the world, rain would probably always be viewed as a good thing, like a refreshing thing. So what if we probably rely so much on our phones anymore that we don't even look at the sky to see how the weather's going to be. So even if clouds come over us, if the phone says it's not supposed to rain, we're not going to be expecting it to rain. But without that, you see clouds coming in, and you're like, well, it's about to rain. But then what if it doesn't rain? Here come the clouds, just all day, they're just rolling over, passing over. Never a drop, at least on you, on your area. He says that's how they are, these false teachers. Now, how could that relate to false teachers or describe false teachers? Waterless clouds? Okay. They don't deliver. Nothing good. The good stuff doesn't come. And I think the main idea in that picture is it looks like it's going to, but it doesn't. The clouds, not waterless clouds as in clouds that you don't even expect to have water in them, like the big puffy cotton ball clouds that, the big white ones that's not a rain cloud. But I think the idea that he's getting at is they're clouds that have the appearance of precipitation, but it never comes. Promising without delivering. All talk, in other words. They may talk a big game. They may say things that fill you with hope and comfort and whatever, but it's empty. It's vain. It's not gonna. Their promises are empty, and it's not going to deliver. Drought and famine is all you can look forward to following them. Peter said something very similar to that in 2 Peter 2:17. These are waterless springs and mists driven by a storm. For them, the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved. That's very, very similar to what Jude says here in verses 12 and 13, especially the middle of verse 12 and then the end of verse 13. The gloom of utter darkness has been reserved forever, just like what Peter said. So, hidden reefs, waterless clouds, swept along by the winds, just passes right over. Doesn't give any nourishment or refreshment to the land or the people. Fruitless trees. This one may be the easiest to see what the idea is. Fruitless trees, a very common analogy in the Bible. Fruitless trees. And again, the implication is it's a tree that you would expect to have fruit, but it doesn't. So remember when they were walking into the city that morning, and it says that he was hungry, so that he walked over there to that tree. He saw a fig tree with leaves on it, which implies that it's going to have fruit underneath the tree leaves. That's the order that the fig trees, that's how they grew. So he sees leaves on it. He says, well, that tree's going to have some fruit on it, and I could use a little bit of breakfast. I'm going to go over there and get it. And he found it didn't have any. Not a single fig on that tree. And it wasn't the time yet for them to be picked, so he knew that they hadn't been harvested or picked. So he uses that as an illustration of the nation of Israel, that they have all the appearance of fruit, but they don't have any fruit, really. That's just one example of that kind of illustration. The Old Testament is full of examples of God referring to Israel as a vine, a choice vine that he planted, but then it becomes a wild vine, Jeremiah 2:21, then Jeremiah 12:10. Many shepherds have destroyed my vineyard. They trampled down my portion. They've made a pleasant portion. They have made my pleasant portion a desolate wilderness. In Ezekiel 19, 10 through 14, he says, your mother was like a vine in a vineyard planted by the water, fruitful and full of branches by reason of abundant water. Strong stems became rulers' scepters. It towered aloft among the thick boughs. It was seen in the heights with the mass of its branches, but the vine was plucked up in fury, cast down. The east wind dried up its fruit. They were stripped off and withered. And he goes on and on about it being consumed and dry and withered and wild and desolate. Isaiah 5, verses 2 through 5 says, he dug it and cleared it of stones. He planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it. He hewed out of a wine vat in it. He looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now I'll tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I'll remove its hedge. It shall be devoured. It will break down. I will break down its wall. It shall be trampled down. These are the kinds of things that God declares throughout the Old Testament and even in the New Testament about things that are expected to bear fruit that don't. Jude calls the false teachers fruitless trees in late autumn, twice dead, uprooted. So they may have the promise of fruit, but when the time for the fruit comes, nothing. Now, what good would that be in literally a tree like that? Well, remember the parable of the barren fig tree? The man planted it, didn't have any figs. He's like, all right, I'm going to cut this thing down. Because you know what it's good for? Nothing. In fact, it's not just that it's good for nothing, it's actually negative because it's taken up space and resources of a tree that would actually bear fruit. So in the end, I'm cutting it down, throwing it in the fire. That's all it's good for. Well, with false teachers, they may have the promise of fruit. They may promise you fruit. They may look like they have fruit, but they don't, Jude says. So don't believe your eyes necessarily. I'm going to tell you the reality of it. These false teachers are fruitless trees, and they don't have fruit in themselves, good fruit anyway, and they can't help you have fruit. In the end, they will give you nothing but company, I guess, in the utter darkness that's reserved for them forever. Then he says, they're like wild waves of the sea, casting up the foam of their own shame. You know, these wild waves, and there'll be foamy stuff, in the water. Wild waves. Now, he goes on ahead and uses that extra description of casting up the foam of their own shame, but a wild wave is a pretty dangerous thing. Deceptively dangerous also, just like the hidden reef or the hidden rock. There's more power in that than you might anticipate, and it could suck you under, and it may be the last wave you ever see. It's a dangerous thing. Then he calls them finally wandering stars. It's very interesting, wandering stars. And the reason is because the word that's translated wandering is a Greek word that basically is where we get the word planet. Not the word star, but the word translated wandering. It's planetes. Planetes means wanderer or roamer, and it's generally understood that a wandering star in this context, what he's talking about, is a planet. Now, I'm no expert in astronomy, but I have paid a little more attention to it lately. And one thing that, if you've ever paid any attention, if you look, the ones that are actually planets out there, they look the same, just brighter usually to the naked eye. But you know what they do differently than the stars? I'll give you a hint. The word, he says it right there. And they move.
And they're not actually light sources like a star.
Yeah, but that's too deep. They wander. Now the reason is partly because they're much closer to us than the stars that we see in the sky, but it's also because they're actually moving themselves. Stars aren't. I think maybe there's a case to be made they're moving in some way, but they're not moving around the sun, our sun. They're just other things like our sun. Well, they wander more, they move more than the stars do, because in addition to us rotating, which makes all the stars appear to move, but they move in that regular pattern because they're being still and we're moving. So it makes it look like they're moving, but they used to use those stars for navigation. You can't use planets for navigation because they are also moving around. And if you try to, if you think, well, that's the North Star because it's so bright up there, well, chances are it's probably Jupiter or maybe Venus, depending on the time of year. I don't know if you can, I didn't know how well this would show up, but this was a time, a certain time, I think it was last year. There's 5 planets in this picture in the sky at the same time. They didn't piece this together, but this was actually at the same time. They may have made them a little brighter, but they didn't Photoshop the planets in there. But you know what? You could probably go outside 30 minutes later and they would not be in that same place anymore. That's how fast they move in the sky. Well, they wander. And if you look at the orbit of Venus, Roman's been wanting to see Venus a lot lately, and it's hard to catch Venus because it's so close to the sun. Most of the time you can't see it unless it's right before the sun comes up. So that puts it out of the question for us. And you usually can't see it at sunset, which you can right now. But the orbit of Venus is so weird looking from our perspective. So it's very unpredictable if you don't know how to look for it, because it seems to move so much. And from one day to the next, it's going to be in a totally different place. And the moon moves, a lot too. So it's like, well, yesterday it was right next to the moon, and today it's all the way over here. You can't trust it as far as navigation. So that's how the false teachers are. They're like wandering stars. They're not the stars that are there that you can use because it's a regular thing, but you can't trust it to guide you. Well, that is very clear when we think about using that as an illustration for a false teacher. They're not trustworthy because not only are they deceptively trustworthy, like they look like the other stars, but sometimes false teachers also wander themselves in terms of, they'll say whatever they have to say to get the kind of result they're looking for. That's the danger of doing it that way, is you're going to be tempted to always be changing whatever you're teaching to please people. That's why Paul said, aren't we still pleasers of men? Am I a man pleaser? Because if I am, I'm doing it wrong. Some people may have accused Paul of doing that, and I think they did. So Paul's like, if I'm a man pleaser, I'm doing it wrong because I'm not pleasing anybody with what I'm saying. And his point is, no, I'm not here to please men. I'm here to teach the truth and please God. Whatever that truth is what I'm going to teach. Always the same. He told the churches, what I told this congregation, I'm telling you. And I'm going to tell the next ones, and I'm going to tell them, and I want you to share this with them. It's always the same. Remember what we told you. Remember what we told you. We're teaching the same thing everywhere we go. False teachers might be saying the one thing one day and another thing the next day, depending on their audience, depending on the circumstances, depending on whatever. Can't trust them for guidance, especially in the way of the truth. Just like the planets, unlike the stars, could lead you astray if you tried to use them. All right, he also says, it was also about these that Enoch, this could take us the rest of next week and the week after probably, but he says, about these that Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied, saying, behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him. You can probably see what the emphasis is. He says it about 4 times in that verse. Ungodly, ungodliness, ungodly, ungodly. The bigger question that you might have is, what in the world is he talking about? And where is the book of Enoch that he's quoting? Well, there is a book of Enoch called First Enoch, the one that this is presumably comes from. It's an apocryphal book. Now, he says that Enoch was the seventh from Adam. You can look in Genesis and see that there was an Enoch who happens to be seventh from Adam. And the book of First Enoch, if I'm not mistaken, also says that he was the seventh from Adam. But the book of First Enoch is generally believed to have come from the period immediately before Jesus and even somewhere between then and the years immediately following Jesus' ministry, or Jesus, the first century, I guess, which is not the seventh from Adam. The question is that some people have, and some people use this to show that you can't trust the Bible because Jude is quoting as Scripture, saying that he prophesied, Enoch did, in a book that we don't consider part of the canon. And by the way, neither Jews nor Christians throughout history, either one, considered the book of Enoch, First Enoch, to be inspired and part of the canon. But does Jude think it was? Well, short answer is not necessarily. First of all, it's just an assumption that Jude quoted the book of First Enoch at all. It's possible. It may not be that plausible, but it's at least possible. It's not impossible that whoever wrote the book of First Enoch actually copied Jude, depending on where the book of First Enoch originated from, the time period. But even if it was first, maybe they both were quoting from an inspired source of the past. At the end of the day, the point is, ultimately, this is a quote of an inspired prophecy. It doesn't mean that the book that is called First Enoch was an inspired book. But the prophecy, at least this one that he references here, he seems to at least to indicate that it was an inspired prophecy, and therefore he quotes it. And he doesn't say that prophecy was literally exactly about these false teachers, but it applies to them. And any ungodliness, for that matter. But he goes on, he says, these are grumblers, malcontents, following their own sinful desires. And I would say that may sum it up most of all. False teachers ultimately are following their own sinful desires. Every false teaching that you can ever imagine comes from, whether subconsciously or consciously, a motivation of following your own desires. What other reason could there be, ultimately, for changing the Scriptures or adding to the Scriptures or taking away from the Scriptures? It's always going to be to follow my own desire. And it may not be a sinful desire necessarily, but if I'm changing the Scriptures to meet my desire, it becomes sinful. So the desire may not necessarily be sinful inherently, but, and by that I mean like something inherently sinful, like murdering people or polygamy or things like that. But it could be things that we would consider less important or less of a salvation issue. But if we change the Scriptures in any way to fit that, they become sinful. So that's what these people do. They flatter people. And in the end, he says, remember what the apostles said. They said this was going to happen. In the last time, there's going to be scoffers and following their own ungodly passions. And it's these who cause divisions. They're worldly people devoid of the Spirit. So because of their own sinful desires, they're teaching falsehoods. And by that, they're creating divisions. And whenever you think about what a denomination is, that's exactly how denominations begin. It's a division. The word means division, a divider. And those divisions come up whenever people are no longer walking according to the teachings of Jesus and his apostles. So we need to be aware of false teaching, and we need to not be swayed by it, but we also need to actively address it.